This conference will now be recorded.
Good afternoon. I'm Ben Nathanson, a moderator for AnCan's High Risk Recurrent Advanced Prostate Cancer Support Meeting. We're going to present today highlights from one of the world's foremost conferences for the treatment of prostate cancer, ASCO GU, the American Society of Clinical Oncology's Genitourinary Cancer Symposium, which celebrated its 20th year in January. More than 5,000 people attended virtually and online. Rick was there in person, and moderators John, Len, and myself attended virtually. 337 papers were presented just on prostate cancer. We've selected around a dozen we think are most interesting and relevant. Each of us will spend about 10 minutes describing the papers we picked, and when we've all concluded, we'll turn the call over for questions. Clearly, with more than 300 papers presented, there's a lot more that can be said even about the papers that we do discuss tonight. So for more background on tonight's papers, well, first we'll make tonight's slides available. And on each slide is a link to the abstract of the paper that it discusses, so you can click the link to read details. And on this slide that you see is a big granddaddy link to a web page with every one of the prostate cancer presentations and abstracts. And you can also contact us offline for more information on any, as well as a Q&A tonight, for more information on anything we discuss. And John, Lynn, and I are happy to discuss any of the other ASCO papers that you may be curious about. And as you see, John and I are patient advocate members of ASCO, which means we may have access to additional information regarding some of these papers. I want to stress that although this is an august medical conference, you shouldn't put the kind of trust in these that you put in journal papers. These are not peer-reviewed papers like journal papers. This is more like breaking news. And as always, nothing you hear on this or any AnCan call is medical advice. Always talk to your doctors first. Before we start, I'll ask that you please hold questions to the end. I'll ask you not to raise your hand or unmute or use the chat. We'll break for questions at the end. We've scheduled the talks to leave about 25 minutes for Q&A. So let's start the presentation. I'll hand it over to Dr. John.
Hey guys, hi everyone, welcome. First thing I want to do is thank Ben for all his work making these slides. He made my slides for me, knew it would take me forever. The first paper that I'm going to tell you about is called BRCA, and it was presented by Dr. Hussain from Northwestern University. It's a phase 2 randomized study, has only 61 subjects. And the subjects are men with metastatic castrate-resistant prostate cancer. Dr. Hussain screened these people with germline testing and picked out those with HRR mutations like BRCA1, BRCA2, and ATM for the study in order to try to see whether abiraterone plus olaparaib, which is a PARP inhibitor, was better than either drug alone. The patients taking the combination, abiraterone and olaparaib, had a much longer progression-free survival. I think that's on the slide. Yes, it is. Than either drug alone, and it was tolerated quite well. So the take-home message from BRCA for us is that if you're a new metastatic castrate-resistant prostate cancer patient, get genetic testing. And for those who come up positive for BRCA or ATM, combining abiraterone with this PARP inhibitor is better than either single drug therapy alone. And you'll see, you're probably aware that several of these combination products have been approved by the FDA over the past year. Next slide, please, Ben, or whoever is doing it. After triplet therapy, what's next was a panel of experts who first presented a case of a 63-year-old guy with a PSA rise 18 months after triplet therapy with bone mets, and then asked all the different experts what they would do. And I would really be happy to give you more detail about each of these things, but in the interest of time, I just want to tell you that they talked about chemotherapy versus androgen blocker therapy, lutetium versus radium, androgen blocker therapy versus PARP inhibitors, and SBRT, all different ways that you have available for intensification of your treatment once the initial metastatic CRPC treatment begins to fail. And overall, it was a very hopeful kind of discussion. Pros and cons of all the different treatments were discussed. And there's clearly a lot of research being done about this. So we can be very hopeful about not getting too discouraged when we start to fail first-line treatment once we become metastatic hormone resistant. Next slide. Now this was another panel discussion, but it was the opposite. It was how can we actually reduce the intensity of our treatments without losing effectiveness. And again, a expert, about a half a dozen experts each presented on their particular specialty. Dr. Shore talking about de-escalation by drug holidays. He took a subset of his phase 3 EMBARK study, which compared ENZA with ADT with the combination, and gave this in high-risk patients, gave the patients who had reached a less than 0.2 PSA at 36 weeks a drug holiday. 86% of the ENZA group got a drug holiday versus 68% of the leuprolide mono treatments. Overall, the 2-year outcome for drugs with different kinds of drug holidays was about the same. A rather dismal less than 10% were metastatic free after 2 years. But nevertheless, overall, in terms of outcomes, holidays were good. The people that got holidays were no worse off than the people that didn't get holidays. Holidays and ENZA mono treatment are good de-escalations. So this is, I think, one of our favorite ways of de-escalating treatment is to take drug holidays. There was Dr. Yamawad just talked about another type of de-escalation, which is by taking, for radiotherapy, this is for radiation therapy now. Let's say your total radiation therapy is going to have a total dose of 80 gray or something like that, and it's divided over 36 or 40 sessions. So this is expensive and inconvenient, but it turns out that outcomes are just as good by having less fractions and each fraction at a higher dose. And even to go to the extreme of what he calls ultra hypofractionation, which is SBRT, may not only has just as good of an outcome as the type of 36-40 sessions that most of us experienced, but also is probably even safer because of the excellent aiming for SBRT. He said a couple of side things. He said rectal spacers were quite helpful and encouraged them. He mentioned MRI-guided radiotherapy is better than CT-guided. And overall, it was a very strong argument for the continued advancement of hypofractionation and SBRT, ultra-hypofractionation. Another kind of de-escalation that we could have is can we skip the lymph node dissection when we have our radical prostatectomies? It turns out that we can. Dr. Essen pointed out that the literature doesn't really favor extensive, pelvic node dissection during our, we're always like, well, get every damn lymph node out of our bodies, but it doesn't really help that much. And you can even skip the lymph node dissection entirely in people that are at moderate risk. So if your PSMA PET is negative at the time of your radical prostatectomy in a moderate risk situation, just skip the pelvic lymph node dissection and avoid the lymphedema and other side effects that come with it. And then there was a section by Dr. Aurora about de-escalating treatment by using focal treatments. I mentioned that there are many different types of energy choices for focal therapy, heat and cold and ultrasound, et cetera, and went over all the different types, strengths and weaknesses, and talked about how things like location in the prostate or presence of calcifications might affect the choice of focal treatment. So it gave me the feeling that I think we go to different focal treatment centers, and I get the impression that they sort of do one thing or two things. But this discussion really made me think that a doctor that has access to multiple different types of focal treatment can make a much better informed decision. So focal treatment was encouraged in non-metastatic patients. And he also put in a plug for systematic course biopsies, not focal biopsies, because whether a cancer is on both sides of the prostate and where it's located makes a difference in what treatment you choose. There was a last section about metastasis-directed therapy, which is a way of looking at the sequence of treatments that we have, which can delay but not necessarily avoid systemic therapy. So the take-home message, lots of ways of de-escalating treatment, lots of doctors very willing and very interested in de-escalating and reducing treatment. Next slide, please. Neuroendocrine cancer is something that we worry about a lot, and oftentimes as our cancers advance, they transform into small cell or neuroendocrine cytology, and they tend to lose their expression of PSMA. And this is a study of a very interesting compound that targets neuroendocrine cancer cells because there's a particular site on a neuroendocrine cell called DLL, which has a targeting agent that's been developed. And it's only a phase 1 and a little bit of a phase 2 study. And out of all the small cell cancers, there were only 10 with prostate cancer. But the outcome actually was quite good. There was a few troublesome side effects, particularly the cytokine release syndrome that you get with any immune type of treatment. But I thought it was a kind of a hopeful study, and I think this is going to come up in our group later. Last slide. I'll try to wrap this up in a minute or two. Are patients with prostate cancer at risk of suicide, like patients with cancer in general? And this was a very large retrospective cohort study of GU cancers where they found that, yes, indeed, people with GU cancers, including prostate cancer, had an elevated risk for suicide, particularly in the year after diagnosis. Also higher in whites, in non-Hispanics, and in people who were single. And so Dr. Ayaz emphasized that looking for high-risk people, picking them out, screening them, and taking care of this may actually reduce the number of lives lost to suicide. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So Rick's slides are next. Rick, you're muted.
Good evening to everybody. As Ben mentioned, I was there in person. It's a real zoo. especially if you're trying to work the conference, which I was. I had 10 meetings in person on the Friday and then running into so many people on the first day, on the Thursday. So I am truly grateful to Ben and to Len and to Dr. John for covering all of the posters and for John covering the presentations. There were a number of posters. I think I picked out 40 posters that I wanted to look at. I'm lucky if I saw 10 of them, and a couple caught my eye, which I hadn't picked out. And I'm just going to talk to you very quickly about 4 of them. And all of these posters really reiterate what you hear in our groups. So just to let you know, we're not making it up here. There is evidence for what we tell you. And I'm going to kick off by talking to you about why it is that we hammer home that you need germline and somatic testing, because we live in an age of precision medicine, and you can't have precision medicine if you don't know what to be precise about. And it's the germline and somatic testing that makes us able to do that. Germline, of course, is inherited. Somatic's what you make yourself. And in a study that was led by Neil Shore and supported by Illumina, they checked 500 sites across the country. In 20 and 21, they came up with about 1,000 men who had metastatic castrate-resistant prostate cancer. And what they found was that 40% of those men had not been tested, either for germline or somatic. I mean, it's scary. Despite the fact that the guidelines at AUA and at ASCO and at NCCN ask for testing, which is why we always ask you. Now, of the 60% who were tested, most of those people got somatic testing. 60% of them got somatic, 20% got germline, only 4% got both, which is understandable if you do the somatic testing first. And very few of them got a PARP inhibitor, probably because very few of them had BRCA1 and BRCA2 mutations. So a third got PARP inhibitors. And that's probably about right, because the remaining HRR mutations don't respond. So takeaway, get somatic testing. Next slide, please. We often ask what works after Pluvicto, and I happened to stumble across this slide, which was prepared by McGill, the people at McGill. A very small study, that's the caveat. 55 people, small cohort. Only 23 of that cohort were actually treated after radioligand therapy, Pluvicto, and using a PSA measure that the post-Pluvicto therapy would drop their PSA by 50. The only real success was with chemotherapy. And what's interesting is far more people dropped their PSA by 50 if they did their chemo before the Pluvicto than after the Pluvicto. So maybe there is a reason to do your chemotherapy early. I will say that other studies have suggested the reverse, and I will also say that actinium seems to be a good alternative after Pluvicto, so there are other options, but don't put up too much of a fight doing your chemotherapy before your Pluvicto. Next slide, please. We're sticking with Pluvicto, and I had ticked this one off, and I went over and spoke to the principal investigator, Dr. Lee, who is at the University of Kansas. And again, it wasn't such a huge study, just 53 patients. And they were looking at how long that flare lasts, because a lot of our Pluvicto guys get very nervous when their PSA goes up early on. Well, it turned out that of his 53 patients, only 7 experienced a PSA flare, and only 2 experienced that with pain, with bone pain, and most of that had gone within about 2 weeks. and the PSA continued to decline for another 12 weeks. So I can tell you that's by and large our experience. I can think of one gent who had pain right the way through his fourth or fifth study, but that's by and large what happens. And so the takeaway is you may see a flare, don't get bent out of shape. It's usually only for the first treatment that you'll have pain and your PSA will return. And my last slide reiterates a message that you hear all the time, which is that you've got to have a GU medical oncologist from a center of excellence. There, I got to the bottom line before I told you what was in there. What happened, this study was done by one of our advisory board members who we like a lot, Dr. Stacy Loeb. She's a urologist at NYU Langone. She does a lot of quality of life studies. And they did in-depth double-blind interviews with HCPs, largely uros and medical oncologists, to find out how they manage hormone-sensitive men and metastatic hormone-sensitive men, and who adds something beyond Lupron, or an LHRH drug, I should say. And it turned out that of the 36 people they interviewed, 20 of those people added nothing. They just left them on LHRH, even though they were metastatic, and even though that's against the guidelines. Of the 16 who did add something, 14 of them were from centers of excellence. So if you wonder why we push you towards GU medical oncologists at centers of excellence, this is the reason. And that's it. Those are the 4 slides, and I'm handing off to Ben. I picked you up some time, Ben.
Muted, Ben.
Okay. So these researchers wondered if men who have genitourinary cancers, including prostate cancer, were more susceptible to also getting a second kind of cancer. So as you see, they looked at the records of over 1 million patients. And in general, 1 in 10 patients with a genitourinary cancer had another cancer. In prostate cancer, they found it was most often thyroid cancer, and if the patient had had radiation, it could also be peritoneal or bladder cancer. The takeaway is clearly that our doctors should be alert to warning signs of other cancers and to follow up with testing. This is an interesting contribution to a discussion about Pluvicto that you will often hear on our calls. There were 2 big lutetium trials, Therapy in Australia and Vision in the US. And unlike Vision, Therapy required an FDG PET scan in addition to a PSMA PET scan, and it had a higher bar for PSMA expression. The question that this paper tried to answer is whether those high standards of therapy excluded patients whom Pluvicto might have helped. So what the researchers did, they looked at Vision patients who would have been rejected under the therapy requirements and found that although their PSA rose faster, their tumors didn't progress any faster. There was no change in radiographic progression, and they didn't die sooner. This is not the last word. It was a small study, but it was an interesting one. I would also say, I should also say that as a practical matter, it's important to understand that as patients, we can get Pluvicto even if we don't meet the therapy standards. This is not going to change our treatment. The results suggest that even if you aren't tailor-made for Pluvicto, like the therapy patients were, you still might benefit. So one subject that scares us as patients is the prospect of our tumors growing while our PSA remains flat. And even if this is discovered quickly, it turns out that this is a bad prognosis. So we'd really like to know which patients this is likeliest to happen in so we can keep an eye out for it. These researchers went back to an earlier enzalutamide study, and they looked for clues as to what might characterize these patients, but found there were no obvious differences with the other patients. They plan to dig deeper and try to find a molecular profile that will identify these patients. But they did find that even these patients with their worst prognosis still benefited from enzalutamide. I think this is my last, is patients were always gambling off quality of life in hopes of survival. It would be nice to have a number that could tell us how horrible a treatment is likely to be in terms of side effects, and another number to tell us how beneficial that treatment is likely to be so we could make a rational trade-off. So this effort was an effort to produce a new score for clinical trials, an overall numeric toxicity score that captures the severity and prevalence of the side effects. The idea is to compute the toxicity scores of the experimental arm, that is the patients of the new treatment, and of the control arm, the patients getting standard therapy. So you can then compare how much more toxic or less toxic the new treatment is. And trials already have a number. They already report a number expressing how likely patients were to benefit. That's the hazard ratio. So in considering a treatment, you could more clearly weigh the severity of new side effects using this number in principle against the predicted benefit and make a principled decision whether to go forward. It's a nice idea, but it's hard to know how different people will weight different kinds of toxicity. Is it some people may be more troubled by certain kinds of toxicity. Sometimes the prevalence is the prevalence more important, the severity more important? I'm not sure how they come by the number. It's a nice idea, but I don't know how it could be put into practice. So now I'm going to turn the floor over to my colleague, Lynn.
Okay, thanks, Ben. And I have to say, my fellow moderators set the bar high here. Everybody's getting it under the wire. I'll try and do the same. So this first slide has to do with the importance of PSMA PET scan concordance. Ben had a slide that addressed some, I think it was Ben, had a slide that addressed some of that. But this was a presentation from a trial called 3-Tempo. Metastatic castrate-resistant patients. There were 98. Just so you know, it's not a huge study. 46% of the patients who had an FDG positive PSMA negative lesion had a shorter overall survival than those who had no positive FDGs. So the median for those with FDG positive, PSMA negative, was median survival 5.6 months versus not reached. And if the patient had an FDG positive scan that was PSMA negative, they went and did a third scan which was 16% of the patients, is called a dotatate PSMA, dotatate positive PSMA negative lesion. They had an overall survival of only 3 months. Dotatate, you may not be too familiar with that. That targets neuroendocrine type cancers. So the takeaway is an upfront FDG PSMA PET followed by dotatate if there's a discordance between FDG and PSMA, might help clinicians to guide patients away from further systemic therapy and towards more palliative care. Go ahead, Ben.
So did you want to do it graph by graph? We can do it either way. Or do you want me to dump them all?
Well, yeah, I guess in the interest of time, we'll do it this way.
Okay.
All right, this one had to do, I'm going to go quickly through this one, the next one. It had to do with studies sponsored by Janssen, the maker of apalutamide. And the study showed that, first a little background, PSA90 means a 90% reduction in PSA in the first 6 months when you're taking a second-line anti-androgen. And that has been associated with longer survival. So this study looked at the PSA90 of apalutamide versus enzalutamide in metastatic hormone, obviously hormone-sensitive prostate cancer. And it showed that the PSA90 response with apalutamide was reached by 64% of patients, whereas with enzalutamide, only 55%. So the takeaway here, if your med-onc prescribes enzalutamide and you have metastatic hormone-sensitive prostate cancer, maybe have a discussion about substituting apalutamide. Next slide. So here is basically the same study, only instead of comparing apalutamide with enzalutamide, they compared apalutamide with abiraterone or Zytiga. As you can see, there are a total of 917 apalutamide patients, 632 Abi patients. And the conclusions here was that apalutamide achieved that same deep PSA90 response 65% of the time at 6 months with apalutamide, but only if they initiated with abiraterone first, then you only got a PSA90 response of 44%. That's quite a difference. So the takeaway, once again, if your med-onc prescribes Abi, have a discussion about switching to apalutamide. Next slide. This comes up so often in our group. What's the best prednisone dose with Abi? As you can see in the methods area there, this was data from 1,410 patients, so it's quite a large number of patients. Now we all know Abi blocks testosterone, but it also blocks production of cortisol by the adrenal glands. That creates a problem because the body compensates for this reduction in cortisol by secreting ACTH, which is adrenal corticotropic hormone, which is the hormone that tries to boost cortisol. But that leads to a rise in cortisol precursors. And so it's a long mouthful of a word there, but it creates mineralocorticoid activity. Bottom line, that causes hypertension, fluid retention, and hypokalemia, which is low potassium. So the takeaway here is the study showed a significant delay, 96% longer, in the development of hypertension and hypokalemia, or low potassium, from abiraterone with prednisone 5 milligrams twice daily compared to 5 milligrams once daily. So the winner here seems to be 5 milligrams twice daily of prednisone. Next slide. All right, overall survival based on the site of metastases. This was a surprising finding. There was a background meta-analysis, which is basically a systematic literature review of 8,820 patients from 9 phase 3 clinical trials. The conclusion, get to the bottom line here, is that liver metastases were associated with the shortest overall survival. Well, we know that, that's not surprising. But lung metastases showed the longest overall survival. That was a big surprise. And then this little table here shows the median overall survival based on the site of metastatic disease. So with bone as the reference, you had bone metastases have an overall survival median of 59 months, is about 5 years. Lung, 82 months, which is about 7 years. Lymph nodes, 66.6 months, which is, I guess, what, about 5.5 years. And liver, only 45 months median overall survival. And you can see by all of these p-values that these are all statistically significant. Next slide. Okay, so yeah, so the take home here is really for physicians, because when designing trials, they shouldn't necessarily combine liver and lung metastases into a single category of visceral metastases, which usually means that they're going to go ahead with more aggressive therapy. Maybe lung metastases should be separated out from other visceral metastases like liver and brain. Next. Okay, this is paradigm, possibly a paradigm for sequencing PARP inhibitors with lutetium. It's a study, a small study, 49 patients, and they looked at patients who got a PARP inhibitor therapy. If they had a BRCA2 mutation, they had PARP inhibitor therapy before they gave lutetium. So this chart, can you guys see my cursor here?
No,
I don't know.
no.
No? Oh, okay. So the
I
lutetium,
can you see mine? I can move it somewhere.
it doesn't matter, Ben. All right,
Okay.
lutetium. So this is a chart for lutetium PSMA clinical outcomes. If the patient had no PARP inhibitor therapy before lutetium, notice these PSA50 response rate was 100%. PSA progression-free survival was 10 months, and overall survival 23 months. Now you compare that to the patients who did get PARP inhibitor therapy before lutetium, and the results from the lutetium therapy, you only have a 36% PSA50 response, only a 2.2 progression-free survival, and only a 3-month overall survival. Next slide. Okay, so the conclusion here is there appears to be significant cross-resistance between PARP inhibitor therapy and lutetium, and the takeaway was that it was recommended or justified to run trials to see if outcomes might be better if you followed PARP inhibitor therapy for patients who had BRCA2 mutations. Follow lutetium rather than precede lutetium. And I think that's the end of mine. Yes.
Okay. So we're ready for questions. Gosh, right on time. Um, so the way we're going to do this, you would raise your hand if you have a question. Um, if you do not know how to do it, on a computer, you press the react button on your bottom left. On a phone, you press more and then hand. Don't press one of these guys. So Gary Peters, your hand is first. What say you?
Thank you, Ben, and thanks to all the presenters. I wondered if on the slides that compared the use of apalutamide as compared to enzalutamide or abiraterone, has there been any such comparison, or do we have any basis for a comparison as to how that apalutamide would measure up against darolutamide?
No, we don't, Gary, because these studies were done before darolutamide was approved for metastatic hormone-sensitive prostate cancer. So there's no comparison has yet to be made.
Yeah, and I'd like to add something on those slides, which is that when you go back and you look at them, and Len didn't mention this, but you have to take into consideration what follows the apalutamide. So it's all well and good saying, well, the apalutamide does better than the abiraterone, and so go to apalutamide. But one thing we know is that the period of success after apalutamide with anything is, and I'm assuming, this is an assumption, I'm assuming the apalutamide is comparable to the enzalutamide, is not going to be very good, whereas you can probably get more mileage out of apalutamide or enzalutamide afterwards. So it isn't, yes, I'm not arguing that this is a simple result. You're going to do better up front with apalutamide than abiraterone, but you've got to think about what comes after the apalutamide. Len, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, that's true, Rick. Abiraterone following either, preceding either apalutamide or enzalutamide seems to be a better sequence. You get a little more mileage out of the second anti-androgen if it follows Abi. But as I recall, that extra mileage you get is a matter of a few months. I don't think it's anything huge.
I think it was 2 or 3 months versus about 8 months.
Okay.
Which 5 months is significant in trial language.
Yeah.
Jeff Markey, you're next.
Just to comment on the fact that none of the links work for me on my iPad. I sure would like to get the full GU set, but none of
Yeah,
the links
then
work.
you got to get the slides. You can't do it from our display.
All right.
They will work when you get the.
Okay. Okay, great. I'm just wondering if you have BRCA2 from genomic testing, what benefit do you get from doing somatic testing?
Well, there's the first of all, BRCA2 might not be the only mutation you have. So, whilst if you know you have BRCA2 on Germline, I think the question you're asking is, should you even bother with a somatic test? Is that right?
Yes, exactly.
So, one reason is because the germline test isn't going to tell you something like whether you're MSI high or not. It's not going to talk to you about your tumor burden, your tumor burden. I'm trying to think what else, but there's a lot of information in the somatic test that might make you eligible for more than a PARP inhibitor that you will get out of a somatic test that you won't get out of a germline test alone. Anybody want to add to that? Any of the other presenters?
Yeah. There's also the freaky case of BRCA reversion,
Yes,
where
which we've seen.
the mutator unmutates itself, and you're no longer susceptible to PARP therapy because you no longer have the mutation.
Right.
Also, this Abi plus PARP give you 39 months. Well, PARP is pretty aggressive on your body. I had Abi for 24, 30 months. I've been on darolutamide for 8 months. I mean, I'm past we're almost equal to 39 months, and I'm just wondering, is that an average? What is that 39 months based on? Abi plus PARP, is that overall survival? Is that average? How is that number figured out?
That number is progression-free survival. And whether the progression in BRCA was radiographic or chemical, I'm not sure, but I have the abstract behind me and I can take a look at that.
Is that based on Gleason score as well? Because having a Gleason 7, it would seem that you'd have a longer survival than somebody with an 8 or a 9. but they don't
No,
take
it's
that
not.
into account.
No, it's not based on Gleason score. Now, a study can be stratified by Gleason score, but that study was not.
Okay.
You're muted, Ben.
Alan Moskowitz, you are up.
Okay, I have a general question, and it goes to the point that's been made by Rick and others, which says, hey, you should really see a genitourinary specialist, oncologist, when you get to that point. Yeah, I certainly don't disagree. The question for you is, should any of us expect those people, and let's say from a top institution, any of the folks that have been mentioned, should they know or have some knowledge or be aware of, for example, the topics presented now or topics presented a year ago? Or do I essentially, if I need to, spoon feed isn't exactly the right word, but do I need to be in a position to challenge these folks and push back and double check and make sure that that treatment prescribed for me is exactly correct? In other words, should I expect them to keep current? Or is that a fantasy and I've got to keep current? Don't all speak at once.
You should hope and expect that a GU medical oncologist from a center of excellence or an academic institution was probably at this meeting and is keeping quite current. However, there is surely no harm in placing a study in front of somebody.
Yeah, I agree. But there's a lot to pretend. One study isn't so bad to present, or even two. But you
300 would be a lot, yeah.
there's a limit, right? And so that's why I asked this question. How
Right.
much faith do I have in any of the top doctors? I mean, I
So,
don't expect anyone to have a perfect memory and keep fully current.
right. So I would say that you are all doing yourself a big favor by attending this meeting or watching the recordings, because fortunately we've got a bunch of knowledgeable people, more than just the four of us, because there are other people who also attended virtually. And the value of all these minds together tends to bring up studies that we've seen or we've read, with the caveats, because if you'll notice, on almost all the slides, we did raise caveats as to why they may not be valid. And we are more than happy to provide those slides and those links and those references to you and to coach you so that when you go in to see your doc, you are your own best advocate. Now, can you be sure that the doc saw it? I mean, I just got to tell you, these meetings are a zoo. They're a zoo, and it's impossible for the docs to be in all the meetings at the same time. I mean, I ran down at one point, I can't even remember what for. To get a cup of coffee, and I bump into, and it was during a meeting, and I particularly wanted to hear Dr. Misha talk about DLL3 because that is a subject near and dear to my heart. I run down. Who do I run into? Oliver Sartor, Felix Feng, and Marianne, what's her name, from Dana-Farber, and the three of them are together, and I start talking to them, and by the time I get back upstairs, Misha's already into her presentation. So should they have heard Misha's presentation? Maybe they were doing something. Maybe they had something to report. And I got to tell you, it was just as well because Dr. Sartre had forgotten that he was going to be in our webinar the following Monday. So, he kept saying, oh, I'm so glad I ran into you. So this is what it's like. So can we expect them to know everything? And I don't think so. It's Ask Len. It's tough to go through 350 posters. And certainly to study them all. But just keep coming to this meeting, spread the word, tell people to watch, and we'll do our best to keep you on track. Back to you, Ben.
Another point is that this is not solid gold standard information. This is early information. You saw how many of these slides are small studies, intriguing thoughts. Whether any of these things will save your life is questionable. So you don't have to feel, that they should have stayed tuned for all of this because not all of this is the most important stuff they need to know.
Yeah, that's a good point, and that makes a lot of sense. But my expectation then, at least, is they should all know what the current standard of care is. Is that fair expectation?
I mean,
Again,
these are the doctors who are presenting papers at this conference. These are the doctors who are panelists in the conference. These are the doctors ideally you should be seeing.
okay, fair enough. Thank you.
This is John. Those two papers or presentations that I talked about that had multiple doctors talking, they were both followed by panel discussions where they were sort of challenged to agree and disagree with each other. One of them even had audience voting on which treatment intensification they would do. It was reassuring to see that by and large there was a great deal of agreement between the different panelists on the ones that I watched. So they are reading the same literature, I guess. Also, another point to make is that a number of these, two of mine, I think, are one, and many of the poster presentations are interim reports. So halfway through a study, they're stopping to present their results so far to the meeting. They're not even done yet.
John. Peter Kafka, it's good to see you.
Good,
You
good,
like to
good
ask?
job. So John, right out of the starting gate, you brought up the approval of Abi and olaparaib for BRCA, and
Yeah.
you mentioned it's approved for germline BRCA mutations. Is it only approved for germline BRCA mutations, or is it somatic as well?
The FDA approval, you mean?
Well, you said it's for germline BRCA, and I was wondering,
Yeah.
so it's not applicable for somatic mutations.
Oh boy, I don't know. I would have to read the FDA approval wording and see if it specifies whether these are whether they're only talking for germline mutations or whether they're talking about either germline or somatic mutations, which I assume.
Well, you
I'm
mentioned germline. You mentioned germline, so that's what I'm questioning.
Peter, I'm 95%, 99% sure it's germline and somatic.
I
Okay.
mentioned germline only because that's the only type of test that they did in that particular study. But I think it applies to somatic testing as well.
Okay. Well, worth further questioning. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I can look it up.
Yeah, and there's never been any difference in response discovered between somatic and germline BRCA mutations. So everything that a germline mutation does, a somatic mutation responds similarly. We've asked that question to the experts before, and I'm pretty certain that these tests apply to either somatic or germline. The only possible difference that I can see, and we would have to check this out and we could ask, is the side effects from a somatic mutation may not be as comprehensive as the side effects from a BRCA mutation, because the BRCA mutation's in every cell. And so if there are any downsides to the PARP, it's going to affect every cell, whereas the somatic mutation is only in a part of your body.
John, John A., your hand is up. Is that a mistake?
No, I meant to ask Len a question. I was kind
Oh,
of I, I was kind of scandalized by that slide about lutetium PARP sequencing. And I would like to go back and look at that slide again and see what poster it was and see if there's anything else that I can squeeze out of that poster. But wasn't that awful? That was a substantial difference. And when you think about people sequencing the wrong way, having such a terrible outcome, I was pretty struck by that.
Yeah, I was too, John. And it isn't clear whether it's simply a sequencing issue or simply cross resistance, so that it probably
Could go
wouldn't.
both ways, yeah.
Yeah, going both ways, exactly. That's why they need to run prospective trials.
Yeah.
Maybe in a crossover. No, you can't do a crossover, but cohort A, cohort B, start with either one or the other.
Yeah, because the first drug might be teaching the body to be resistant to the second treatment.
Yeah.
Well, there's another thing, though, too, that occurred to me when you presented it, Len, which is that the PARP-I may be dealing with the low-hanging fruit. And so once it's gotten rid of all the low-hanging fruit, it's the lutetium after the PARP inhibitor has a much tougher job on its hands. So it's not going to do as well as if it were the other way around. I mean,
Yeah.
that's just a theory, but I'm just surmising.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a legitimate speculation, but they'd have to run trials to prove it.
I mean, I'm sorry if you said this, if the overall survival from start of treatment, from the start of the sequence, either way is the same, then clearly they've each, none has taken anything from the other. If whenever you start the sequence, whatever sequence it is, they live the same amount of time, then we haven't lost anything by starting with one or starting with the other. It may be deceptive to see how long they last after one treatment ends if the sum total of the treatments is the same.
And that we don't know yet.
Jeff Markey, you had another question?
Yeah, with bone mets, you said that there was a 59-month overall survival. If you have them zapped, what's the effect of that on the overall survival? Does it start over the counter? What's not included in the test?
I think that was your slide, Len. Oh, Len, maybe
Not mine.
you had the survival by site of Mets.
Oh, is that what you're talking about, Jeff?
Yeah, the overall survival based on site of mets, and bone
Oh,
mets was
yeah, that is
59
me.
months. And if you have it zapped, which effectively removes the metastasis somewhat, I guess, does that affect the 59 months? Was that included in the test in any way, shape, or form? Was that considered?
I think we just have to assume that for all of those sites of metastases, the patient was receiving standard of care therapy, whatever it was. It might have been radiation, might have been chemo, but they weren't looking at what type of therapy was being used. They just looking at what was the median overall survival.
Okay.
In other
This is
words,
John.
Jeff, they note a metastasis and then they measure how long it is to whatever the event is of death. in this case.
Right.
And all the treatments in between are not resetting anything.
Okay.
So they zap it, but it could come back again. So it's just from the time it was noted to the end event, accounting for all the treatments in between.
This is
What
John.
was
I
was
think
that
this
an
is good.
average then? Was that an average?
Median.
Median. So as many above as below.
Median.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Can
I
we
saw,
can we
I
try
saw,
and can we try and get to we have 3 people, I think, still, and a couple of people who haven't had a question yet. So can we just try at least get to the couple of people who haven't had a question yet, Ben?
Fair enough. Jim Marshall, that would be you.
Yes. Dr. John, on the Abby plus elaborate for the BRCA plus the ATM, did they happen to break out the BRCA numbers versus our ATM?
the numbers were too small.
So did they have any ATM?
Yeah,
Do
I
you
think it
know?
was I think it was a very small handful.
Okay.
Again, I can reach behind me and I can get the abstract and I can find out.
Okay, I was curious because I have ATM somatic.
Okay,
Okay, I thank you very much.
I think the numbers were significantly fewer than 10, if I remember, but I will take a look when I get my hands free here.
Okay, thank you.
By and large, Jim, ATM is marginally, I mean, in all the various studies, what we've seen is, and Len is really more of an expert on this than I am, but by and large, we've seen that ATM is marginally responsive, and so is PALB, but they're really marginal, but they are responsive. So you might be lucky, you might not be lucky.
ATM was 11.
Out of how many, John?
60, what did I say, 61, 65, something like that? 61. 11 out of 61 had ATM.
And
BRCA2 was 46.
And do we know how many of those ATM responded?
The data are not stratified by that.
Right. I will tell you, she's been very covert about releasing that in all her studies,
Dr.
going
Hussain?
back to the beginning. And she's been challenged on it, and she never. And I think Len may remember, John may remember. I think somebody asked her about that in the plenary, in the questions, and she avoided the answer,
Hmm.
if I'm not mistaken. She doesn't like to talk. She doesn't like to talk about it.
I think
Thomas
that
Jacobson.
I
I'm
couldn't
sorry.
get the whole paper because of paywall.
Thomas Jacobson, you had a question?
Yeah. I don't know if you guys know, early on in the slides, there was a mention of metastasis directed therapy. And it's just a quick question. I don't know what that means. Or is that just a general term? I can't point you to the right slide because I'm not looking at them, but maybe you guys remember.
There's a trend to I can't I think it's called adaptive therapy. There's a trend I see to develop plans that can change on the fly.
But
So
that's not metastasis-directed therapy.
no, but metastasis-directed therapy means that I guess it means that if a metastasis appears, that should that be treated uh, with focal therapy or not, right, Ben?
Yeah, yeah, it's the ZAP. If you're oligometastatic, right? If you have just a few metastases, um, they sometimes tackle them with radiation one by one. in an effort. If that's what develops after you have a primary cancer, if that's the kind of metastasis you have just a few in places that they can radiate, they will zap just those places and avoid giving you um, uh, abiraterone or anti-androgens.
So
Okay,
that
so
doctor
That
said, that doctor
that
said
term is
that,
specific to radiation?
no, no, any type of metastasis-directed therapy.
Okay, it was just a bullet point, and I thought it was something specific, a specific kind of therapy, and I don't know what it means.
No, I think, Ben, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's a general category of therapy that may uh, change the local tumor environment, but is not going to change the overall body's. Uh, well, the person that presented it said metastasis-directed therapy may have the potential to delay systemic treatment. So,
that's the kind of thing I was talking about by directing primarily radiation. I guess in principle it could be something else at tumors. If your recurrence is oligometastatic, but if they direct radiation at the tumors, may not have to give you systemic therapy right away. You may buy some time before you need the systemic therapy
could be surgery, I suppose.
or cryo. The same things they do
Hmm.
for local. So, Harry Spila, we have not heard from you. I'm sorry. Did we answer your question, Thomas?
No, but I guess I'll go back and look because I just don't understand what the term means. I've seen it
Okay,
before, and I guess I skipped over
Thomas.
it.
So let me just be as precise as I can, and then we'll go to Harry. And I think that might have to be the last question, and we can take the others in writing. It is therapy that is um, directed at the lesions, but does not require systemic. So it's any type of therapy that we could address to a lesion that you may have, a metastasis that you may have, but delays taking systemic therapy.
Okay,
Does
that's
that
it.
make sense?
Sure. Okay.
So Harry was next. Harry Spila.
Yeah. John, I think it was on your presentation. I want to make sure I understood it correctly. And it had to do with a drug holiday. Was it that after 2 years, 10% went metastatic, and that numbers were similar for people who didn't go on a drug holiday? Did I hear that correctly?
No, and the people who are on the drug holiday, whether they came from ENZA mono or whether they came from ADT mono, they had similar outcomes, um, which was less than 10% metastasis free. Of those without a holiday, well, that's not relevant really.
So it was less than 10% were metastasis free.
Yeah.
So after 2 years, we're talking more than 90% had.
Yep.
Wow. Okay. Thanks.
These were pre. Let's see. How did Embark pre-select their people? They were high risk, but I don't know how they exactly defined it. They were all high risk to start with.
So
So that basically says to take a 2-year drug holiday is kind of risky.
No. It says that high risk patients are to have high risk disease is kind of risky.
High risk, yeah, okay. I only ask
there was
because
no
that's me.
there was no difference, Harry. There was no difference from what I remember John saying. There was no difference if you took the holiday or you didn't take the holiday. Both groups had 90% metastasis.
Yeah, I'll
So
look
take
that
the
up too.
holiday.
I'm not sure Dr. Shore gave us the number for those without a holiday.
We've got to move along here. We're going to take one question from one person who hasn't, and this will be the last question. And then Gary and Peter, please submit your questions to whoever the presenter was that the slide relates to. But we want to try and start the support meeting at 3 o'clock. And Jeff Dwyer, you haven't had a chance to answer a question yet, so let's make this the last one.
I think he just left.
Yep. He just left.
Okay, well, in that
Can I ask a
case,
question? Can I ask a quick question? If nobody else has a question.
I just, no, I want to wrap it up now.
Okay.
We will be distributing the slides in a blog post tomorrow. People will have access to the slides and through them access to the abstracts. And of course, you can always send us email and we will answer remaining questions.
I'll try to get back to you guys about the questions I couldn't answer.
and John, thank you. First of all, a huge thank you to Ben for acting as master of ceremonies, for herding these cats. It was not an easy job. For getting all of the slides together and making them beautiful presentation format. And it's not a job that I envy. And he did a great job. And I think that this will come out really, really well in the recording. We're going to do our best to split the recordings. We're not turning the recording off right now, but we're going to do our best to split the recording. So there'll be a support group recording and there'll be a recording that addresses GU ASCO. For tonight's meeting,